in the midst of all of that, there's a lot of discussion in the 4th century about worshipping images that people don't pay a lot of attention to, and some of it may be forgeries of the iconoclasts later. Some of it is certainly not, but we have things prior to Gregory the Great that do talk about that, but not until the end of sort of the middle to mid-4th, maybe to the early 5th century. So that's what I work on.
Yeah, that's interesting because I was like, I have a book that it's quite bold, quite a bold proposal that like covered basically the whole controversy since the first authors to, I don't know, 14th and 13th centuries. Because, for example, I was working with this Muslim scholar because he knows quite a lot of Islamic history on the sources that I could find of about Muhammad and people close to Muhammad, and relating what they knew of the Christian practices in Arabia and the closest regions, and was like surprised because, for example, if you go for the first polemical treatises of 8th century, for example, the letter of Umar to Leo III, the Byzantine emperor, which some people say it's not safe from being like a later forgery or something like that. And the issue of icon veneration always turns in those treatises. Basically all the 8th century treatises I know, from like John of Damascus, from the letter from Umar, and another one. It's like 730. It's from near Baghdad, and they are all covered this subject because. But when I was trying to look for Arabian evidence, I could find, for example, evidence for having Christian images like pictures of Mary and Christ and such like that, but there was no really source indicating like their veneration. And if Muhammad itself didn't criticize on a veneration of images, but he criticized it, like the veneration of Mary to being like something like a goddess in Muhammad's view, and was like trying to elaborate a thesis to say that Science Arabia was somehow delaying in their Christianity, like most of Arabia was probably pagan, and there's like Christian minorities from some regions next to Persian Empire and such like that they might not have achieved that development by early 7th century. And in fact, like that's interesting because I don't know if you have read. It's not really your in much of your area of interest, but it's like Thomas Noble, Iconoclasm and Carolingians, and he has this thesis. Uh, I'm not saying if I'm saying thesis right or because it's like, yeah, sorry for my English, and have this idea that icon veneration started in Byzantine Empire, especially in the Greek world, by the time of Gregory the Great. And he has this idea that when Gregory the Great wrote that letter to the Bishop of Marseille in France, he was actually criticizing a Byzantine invention, not something that was like a local pagan syncretism with local religions and Christianity.
Well, let me just ask this question, and we don't want to get into a debate, but
Okay.
if Gregory the Great is writing to a man in France about something that's happening in Arabia, that seems a little crazy to me, or even in Byzantium. So Serenus, as the bishop in Gaul, in Marseille, is saying, this is going on at my home. He's not saying it's going on in Greece.
Yeah.
So it isn't just Gregory. You can go all to the beginning of the 4th century, or sometime in the 4th century, there's a council in Spain that says we shouldn't be worshiping images on walls.
Yeah, like Elvira. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a little bit in Augustine, and there's some stuff in Epiphanius, which may be a forgery. It's not certain.
Sorry, I didn't understand which author.
Epiphanius.
Oh yeah, of Salamis. Yes, I noticed that because when I was reading Understanding Early Christian Art, I didn't notice Epiphanius being mentioned. I found Eusebius of Caesarea, but I didn't find Epiphanius. I was like, oh, I have to ask that.
Well, it comes up later. I mean, I actually am revising that book. I haven't thought about that question, but I wasn't so interested so much in the question of idolatry or veneration. Now I am, and I could probably spin out a few other texts, but there's a fair amount of suggestion that we really see some development of something which would make sense. I mean, Christians are living in a Roman world, and they already, many of their neighbors would have been actually going and making sacrifices in front of images of the gods. Why wouldn't they also do this? I mean, so it just sort of, it's part of the culture. And we can't expect Christians to be immediately all different from everybody else. And what they're doing is they're just using the images of their own saints and their own God. I mean, so that's in their minds just fine, right? So,
yeah, I mean, in your book, you have, but that's just like a footnote. Yeah, you mentioned that Augustine's mother, Saint Monica, used to carry cakes and wine and bread to the places of the saints. And I was just like looking for the reference, and the bishop, the local bishop, forbade her from bringing those things. And that's something that Faustus, the Manichaean, he also accuses Augustine of the Christians doing the same as the pagans did. And then he uses the very same example of the cake, of the wine, and of the bread. And I find interesting that Augustine never denies that. I mean, I think that he's sort doing of a fallacy, because he's not actually answering Faustus' argument of saying no, Christians are doing that. He's trying just to give like a turnaround.
Christians were doing it, and we know they were doing it. And a lot of them were doing it. So one of the things, there's a difference here between perhaps the veneration of saints' tombs and relics. So we have three things that come up in the middle of the 4th century that are different from anything that happened before. And the first thing is that people begin to venerate relics. There's already a cult of saints, but the idea of tombs and bodies and relics being venerated doesn't really happen until around 360.
Oh, sorry, could you repeat the date? It's the 3rd century, you say?
Fourth century.
Okay, 4th century. Yeah, that's interesting, because I was reading that against Vigilantius, made by Jerome, and Jerome says that I mean, I don't know if that's in France or in Spain, or perhaps that's a border region, and he says that Vigilantius was having the approval of the local bishop, and Jerome was like, "Oh no, that guy's wrong," and he's calling him names and things like that. So there's like a 4th century controversy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that. I mean, it tells you when this happened. And the other thing that happens is that people start going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, which didn't happen before Constantine built a shrine there, or So things are changing, and the religion is changing, the practices are changing. And along with that, I'm saying that we also now start to see more praying to the images of saints and Christ as well. So it doesn't take all the way to Gregory the Great before we see this happening. It's really much earlier. Now that's my argument. Not everybody agrees with me. And I'm probably going to get some criticism, but I think I've got it pretty clear in my own head that this was already happening. And I think it was happening just because it's sort of part of the culture. And the one thing that Christians do not do is they don't make statues.
Yeah.
And we have very, very few statues. We have a few, but so few that it's almost the proof of the pudding.
I mean, sorry for interrupting you again, because I'm very interested in this topic, but have you read the letter of Julian of Atramitium to the bishop of Ephesus, which is called Hypatius, something like that? And something that's interesting that Julian says about to Hypatius, because Julian's just mad about images and such. The letter is probably from the times of Justinian, so early 6th century.
Yeah.
And he said that, oh no, because we do not approve statues except if it's outside the church. And that's something strange, because Orthodox Christians, they generally have like an uneasy situation with statues. At least I know Orthodox theologian in Brazil specifically that wrote against Orthodox statues. And actually, I find many references in the time of Nicaea and the whole iconoclastic controversy against the images. And I also have the Pedalion who say, oh no, if statues were a thing by the time of the iconoclastic controversies, the iconoclasts would say, hey, they are using statues instead of just icons. And I think that's like an interesting topic.
Mm-hmm. So it's all very there's a good work on probably there's so many books to tell you about. I'm trying to think how to not. I probably need to go pretty soon because I have to get dinner on the table here at home. We have some people coming to dinner, but I think what you might want to look into is the difference between 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional work,
Yeah.
and maybe look into the difference between narrative and portrait work. So a narrative image is one that depicts a scene from the Bible, let's say. A portrait doesn't have a context, it's just a face and a body, maybe sometimes with a little behind it. But what you do is you make contact with the eyes of the figure and you can offer a prayer. But you don't offer a prayer to an image of Jesus doing something. Entering Jerusalem, let's say. There's no way, there's no reason. So it's a different function of the artwork. It plays a different role. It may not be a didactic role. It may not be one that tries to teach people their Bible stories, as Gregory says. I don't think that actually is true. But it has a different function than one of an image when one would offer a prayer to. And a statue is a different kind of thing because it's also a portrait without any context. It's just a figure standing on a pedestal or a bust on a pedestal. It also has a kind of reality that one doesn't want to make in a portrait. A Byzantine icon is intentionally not meant to fool you into thinking this is a real thing. And maybe it's that it's too close to looking like those Roman statues of the gods. So the Christians are really trying to separate themselves in that way by not making those. And so I think those are some of the points that I would sort of emphasize.
So they're adopting secular culture and even religious culture from the Roman Empire, but they're sort of making a line. So okay, from this point here, we're not doing the same.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, this looks too much like those pagans.
Yeah.
Those Roman statues. And there's one other thing there's a whole lot of stuff at the end of the 4th century in which the Christian emperors like Arcadius and Honorius and Theodosius I are told that they need to tear down the pagan statues and tear down the temples and remove the altars. And they're doing this, and in part, I don't know how much it really happened, but they're now referring to them as creating a huge controversy. I forgot what I was going to say, but this is a really interesting position. So we're replacing what was a Roman god now with the Christian iconography. And that will be pretty much the way it's going to go all the way through Justinian.
That's interesting. I think I don't know if John of Constantinople, I don't know how to pronounce his surname, John Chrysostom or something like that.
Yeah,
because he was kind of removed of his bishop position because of the destruction of an imperial statue near Constantinople or something like that, because of a rebellion or something.
Well, it's actually in Antioch.
Yeah.
It happened in Antioch. They tore down the statues of the emperor. So there's a lot of treatises on the statues, but they're actually about political things. So there was, this is going to take a long time to explain, but the emperor's statue was often a figure that stood in for the emperor. And so to desecrate or tear down or demolish an emperor's statue was something very dangerous.
Yeah, it means that if you attack on emperor's image, you are attacking the emperor itself. Yeah, if I look at source, that says that, for example, if you are in the presence of an imperial statue and you just pee in front, I mean near them, you're just like fined and go to jail because that's like a huge crime, uh, peeing in front
Mhm.
of an imperial image. And there's also when Constantine, I mean, after he came to power, there he saw like a pagan man like throwing rocks at his statue, and he was just making fun of them and saying, "Oh, no, I'm not being hurt," something like that, because they believe.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a good question to say. How do you, can you punish a person by hurting their statue? Can you, and what is it that's dangerous about that? Other than you're harming public property, that would be one thing. But see, what this is very much about what happens even in contemporary world, right? So we tear down the statue of a tyrant, because, and we do this here in the United States, we're tearing down statues of Civil War generals or something because we want to make a social change. And so people, a ruler can throw stones at the statue or tear it down. Now, that might get them into trouble because the army might step in and say, you're being unpatriotic, you're being disloyal, you're being blasphemous. But there's also an idea here that somehow the spirit or the genius of the emperor has a connection to the statue. Now, when you do that, when you can say that, you can then begin to understand how it is that people can say, I can offer a prayer to an image of the saint and it will be transferred to the saint. I have this as a mediator. I don't need to have it. I can pray to the saint without a picture of the saint. But I have a picture of the saint is much better.
Yeah, I mean that's the
Because,
same argument Celsus employed in the third century, I mean the second century, and Origen answering the third, because that's something that some people that argue for the whole aniconistic thing of Christianity, they would use Origen to say like when Celsus say, "Oh no, the Christians have no images and they are dumb because they are saying that because they are praying to the actual wooden stone when they're not praying to the wooden stone, we use like the wooden stone as means to reach the thing represented in the image itself." Uh,
mhm,
and
yeah.
there's like a Catholic author. I mean, he's Italian. His name is Angelo di Berardini. He's the
Oh, Angelo Berardino.
yeah Berardini. Yeah, I got his the translation of his dictionary of patristic, and yeah, I don't know the title, but dictionary of patristic something. And he says that because most of the arguments employed by the time, for example, John of Damascus, are pretty much the same. The pagans arguments were doing against the Christians, and now there's like the situation is like twisted against them.
Mhm,
And
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
but I mean, if you like really looking for sources, I would really recommend the translation of the Seventh Ecumenical Council by John Medham. Is the most popular translation of Isaiah the Second, and it's useful because they are dealing with a lot of sources. And since John is an Anglican, he used the footnotes to refute the whole passage. But there is a source, for example, I think that's very much poorly treated. It's John of Thessalonica or John of Salonica, which was a 7th century bishop, and his is called against the Gentiles. And the Gentile is just saying, "Oh, how you say we are?" I mean, it's probably like a contemporary type of debate against probably a contemporary pagan of the region, and he's saying that the pagan is saying, "Oh, why you accuse us of idolatry when you are using and praying and venerating statues and images in yourself?" And John is just answering, "Oh, but he is just like saying an apologetic tone and saying that we are not idolaters because Christ and the angels and the saints are actual people, and we don't pray ten with latry." And I think it's interesting because most of the polemics with like Christian and pagan polemics, the issue of statues or idols often come in, but this very specific treaty is the only treatise I know that actually dealing with two icon venerator religions, like the icon venerator pagans and icon venerator Christians. And one of the things John has trouble to answer is the issue of because he says, oh, because they say that idolatry will be like representing something that doesn't have a form, and the pagans say, okay, so why do you make images of angels? Because since they are not they are not they are immaterial, they don't have like a body or something like that. And John's answer is saying like angels actually have a physical body. They're made of air and fire, and that's something that there was just talking to the sheikh, because in Islam the angels are also made of fire and air, and I was just asking him if it was just like a common knowledge of the time. But in Mandra's translation, he says that by the time of Nicaea, it's like 100 years later, people at Nicaea did not think angels have physical bodies. They're like spirits, so they're like immaterial. That's a very interesting topic. But I have to add something in your book. For example, you mentioned Adolf Harnack, the German scholar. Do, I'm not used to his work, but I have been like some people often say to me, stay away of Harnack because he's like a bad story and bad theologian or something like that.
He's very old. It was a very long time ago, so
yeah.
You can't blame him for being who he was. But
the only article I read about Adolf was one about the Apostolic Council of Antioch, because Father Leger, which is a very famous Catholic author from France, was quoting him on how to prove that the Apostolic Council of Antioch was like a forgery, a false document. And he often quotes Harnack in order to support his position. So I find it strange because I think Harnack is very much known for his like liberal positions, and I think that's probably the reason why most people try to avoid him or something like that. And it was like, oh no, is Harnack like
he wrote
reliable?
A long time ago. He wrote a very long time ago. It's not a big deal, but don't worry about it too much. Mostly what I use him for is that he writes from a very Protestant perspective. So, and we've moved a long way. Just to sort of say that there are still, in this country especially, many Protestants who still think that any pictorial imagery in the church is an idol. So that's why I use it. So I think what you're interested in, it sounds like it'd be very good to kind of take it into the question of Islam, but that's a very complicated question about what was going on when Leo III came into the power, and whether Leo began the iconoclastic controversy or his son did, and why this happened at all, and how much of it is to do with Islam, how much it has to do with social reality, how much it has to do with the monks versus the clergy. I mean, it's a very complicated story. It's one that I try not to try to get involved in because there's plenty of other people who are fighting about it, and I thought I would just stay out of that.
Yeah. Because the doctor that helped with my article, it's called Juan Signes de Codonel. He actually gave me his book, and he said he studied with Paul Speck. You probably know him. He's quite polemical. Paul Speck, he's German.
Yeah, yeah. Paul Speck is.
Yeah, it's quite polemical. I just see lots of authors saying, Paul Speck just have like a nonsense methodology of saying whether something's fake or whether something's not. I have trouble to find some of Speck's works because since they are in German, you don't easily find them in the internet. You just find like English authors or English translated works. And that's something that was like complaining with Juan, saying, because in my article of John, I made a mistake saying John was a monk at Saint Sabba's monastery in Jerusalem, and he said that modern research dismisses that, and he say, okay, so we have to find his French books and his German books and his Spanish books, and I say, well, I can't find these books because they're like in other languages. They're barely available in the internet or something.
Well, yeah, I think you may have to figure out how to get a hold of some of the stuff that you're looking for. But it's good. It's good. You're doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
You know a lot of things. You're on a trail. I'm sorry there isn't more help for you where you are. But
Yeah. I mean, when I was in the US, because I was taking a course in Iowa, very much. Whenever when I was like in Atlanta, and people would say, "Hey, Pedro, where are you studying?" I say in Iowa, and they say, "Why? Why don't you go to something that is actually has civilization or something?" But in the university, like Iowa State University, they had some books about it, but by that time I couldn't go to the university library. But yeah, there is like plenty of material available in the US. So yeah, may I ask like some two last questions before you leave?
okay.
So two questions. First one, what's your position, like a current position with Epiphanius? Because I noticed that you're like a quite big of an admirer of Sister Charles Murray. Uh, and yeah, that's some people usually say, no, that her work is great, but they don't often say like why exactly. They just say it's great and something like that. And I get her article like art and early church, and was reading her arguments for Epiphanius, all the Epiphanius evidence being false. And when I asked Josh Elmser, he's British, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and he was saying that although he supports Mary Charles Murray art and early church, he disagrees with her on the idea that the letter 51, the one that collection would be a forgery, because there's no way the iconoclast could forger do a forgery in the Latin manuscript tradition. So that was his position, but he would, in general, like the general idea of Murray's article, he was just like supportive of her. So what's your position?
Well, I can't go into this in length, but I, 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 and she backtracked, but I don't think she should have backtracked. And there's a lot of arguments on both sides. But I actually think that both Eusebius, that letter to Constantia, I think is a forgery. I don't know why anybody insists that it can't be, because he's saying things already in that text that he couldn't have thought at the time that he is supposed to have written it. You have to go into the 5th century before we have those arguments about Christology. And it may be that people who are arguing about this don't really understand enough theology to know that this is impossible. The other thing is that Epiphanius is probably quite a bit of Epiphanius is not a forgery, but a lot of Epiphanius might well be a forgery. And it's very complicated, and that's where Paul Speck comes into the discussion in some ways, and other people. But I try to be really circumspect about it all and say, I think these things could be forgeries, and I won't insist that they are, but here's who thinks on both sides. But I won't try to use them for evidence for my argument if I can't be certain that they're not forgeries. So I think it would actually be it would help me if these were not forgeries, if these were authentic. It would make my case even stronger. But I try not to use them because I think that they could well be forgeries. And there's arguments on both sides of the issue, and it's very complicated. But Mary Charles Murray was the first person to suggest, in my experience, that Eusebius's letter especially was a forgery. And then she got talked out of her thinking about it that way. And I don't know why. I've never been able to talk to her since about it. But
Is she alive or she's dead by now?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I actually... I had thought about dedicating my new book to her, but I wasn't sure. She's very elderly. She's a nun. If she's alive, she's probably very, very close to death. So, and maybe not really much aware of things. So I decided it was too complicated. But so I don't know. but I'm not sure that she should have rescinded her idea, because the arguments against it are purely literary and textual. And I'm not sure that makes any sense if you take the arguments themselves at face value. He's saying things that would have belonged to a much later theological argument. That, Christ has these two natures, and you can't show both natures if you're going to show this exterior image and so forth. That is something I don't think Eusebius, as much as I can tell, would have thought of. And I've tried out asking people who are experts in Eusebius, and then they agree with me. This is not the Sutra this man talks about. He doesn't think like that.
Do you know? Okay, I would say which the names of the specialists. Do you? If you don't remind, you can just send to the email and I just go through.
Yeah, let me see. Hold on.
Okay, because I was talking to Roger Pierce. I don't know if you know him. He's more known as a translator of patristic works, and I think he supports the idea of the fantasy of the letter.
Yeah, a lot of people do. It's not. I'm sorry. A lot of people think it's authentic, and I think they're wrong. But that's just yeah. I'm not saying bad people are not. I just think I know it's a problem. But let me see if I can. I'm going through something here.
Okay.
So Eusebius talks about seeing pictures. He's seen a statue that he says he sees in Caesarea of this woman who's being healed by Jesus. He talks about seeing a picture of Abraham and his three visitors in Mamre when he goes to visit. Then you have this letter where he says, "Oh no, you can't have any pictures of Jesus." Okay, so why can you have pictures of God? Okay, so anyway, see what I can find from my footnote.
Okay.
It's kind of
you said that if those letters were authentic, it would actually be like make your work stronger. And something that I was trying to understand, because I have like many types of positions on this issue, like, oh no, the whole church was aniconic, or oh no, there was like two factions fighting one against the other. So one of them was against the painting of Christ and of the saints, and the idea that, for example, you treat that in your book, saying that there's like a phase. I don't know how to pronounce this word because it's says like shit. Thesis. I'm saying correctly.
I'm sorry.
Academic thesis. It's how it's spelled, like how it's spoken. Academic.
Say it again.
Like THI. Like an academic work, like an academic idea from.
Hold on.
How it's spoken. Okay.
Hold on. I'm gonna go looking for my.
Okay.
What did I do with it? Okay, it'll be footnote 94, footnote 24, page 94. Hang a second. Wait, I'm sorry. 18. Right. Okay. All right. So, okay, those scholars who would accept Eusebius's letter as authentic includes Paul Speck.
Speck believes it's authentic?
Yeah.
Oh, that's very impressive, because that's not what I would expect from him.
Okay, among those who could question the authenticity include Mary Charles Murray, but she revised her opinion based on the challenge by Stephen Garrow, the true image of Christ. Giro's support for authenticity is on the basis of style and vocabulary, which a good forger could obviously copy. Some who presume the letter is genuinely Eusebian include, I take us back up the Florovsky, who says there's no reason whatsoever to question the authenticity. Christoph von Schoenbrunn, God's human face, simply takes it for granted. Charles Barber, figure and likeness, also. Among the scholars who dismiss the letters in